Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And here we are for our second last module, Module 13 on existentialism. And we're going to start by just giving ourselves a brief sort of working definition and then applying it to the work of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So that essentially is what we need to do for this module today. And of course, let's define our terms. What is existentialism? Obviously, it has to do with existence. But what is it specifically when we talk about existentialism as a philosophical concept? It concerns itself with individual, concrete, human existence. This is what we've been aiming for the last, let's say 2,500 years. The existence of individual, concrete people, subjects with identity who live somewhere. So it is not abstract concepts. It's not people in general. It's you and I here, right in the situation. Now, why is that important? Well, because throughout the history of philosophy, individuals who have tried to stand up and let's say, question authority, don't tend to do so well. We can think of Socrates, for example, in 399 BC, who was put to death for doing exactly that. So right from the beginning of philosophy, the individual, the subject, really hasn't fared very well and has taken a long time to assert itself as an entity, as a human construct, we'll say. So existentialism concerns itself with the existence of those individuals in a concrete human social setting. So why is that important? Well, it's important because we're free. Because if we aren't, then we shouldn't even be talking about ethics and morality and choices, because we have them. And if we don't, we're certainly under the illusion that we are. And even if it's illusion, maybe it's because it's important. So let's go for the reality effect and say that we do have a choice. So we do because we are free. We are responsible for everything we say and do. And for most people, that would cause a fair amount of anxiety, because every day we have to think about what we're saying and doing, that what we say and do matters. And there is at the same time a kind of inherent ambiguity in reality and real life. Human existence is also ambiguous. Remember, although we started with the pre-Socratics creating concepts about the world, all those concepts were metaphysical. They are about the world, right? Ideas that informed and ruled and regulated the world that we saw. And because we're metaphysical creatures, as I've said all along, we have a tendency to try to assuage and alleviate that ambiguity and irrationality with concepts that somehow give us a degree of predictability. Well, here we are, and we are free, we have choices, and we live in an ambiguous world. What do? Right? We have to make choices. We can't blindly walk through with our eyes closed, hoping someone else is going to think on our behalf. You don't want that. You want to be able to think on your own. So, if that's the case, existentialism is important because it has to do with concrete existence and the freedom to exist in a certain way and not others. So we're free within social situations. Obviously, we have to follow the law, and no existentialist is against that because there has to be some degree of consistency and at least an alleviation of terror and horror of daily life. But we can live a more authentic life if we are mindful that we can make choices every single day. Now, that is important because it really is encapsulated in probably one of the most famous existentialist philosophical stances, we might say. It's a very famous formula by Sartre who says, existence precedes essence. In other words, our existence defines who we are. And of course, that can go both ways. We can simply flow through life and not make any choices, and things will suddenly overwhelm us, become even more ambiguous. Why? Because we haven't made a choice. We haven't made a decision on any level. So if existence precedes essence, why not make those choices and be a certain kind of person? Because if you are a kind person, you have a temperate sensibility, you are reliable, you're honest and trustworthy, That's the essence of who you are. And that essence is not built on some abstract idea that, well, all individuals are like this. No, clearly not everyone is. Otherwise, why would we worry about people lying? If our essence is to be a good person, we need to live a good life. We can't just walk around with that label on us. Okay, not only that, but in a greater sense, what does this mean? It means that having found ourselves thrown into the world, right, literally, because we are born in a certain place and time, we have no choice over that. We're born into a certain situation. From that point on, we can go on to create what we consider to be our own essential nature in a way that has really never happened before. All through these lectures, I've talked about the individual, the subject, the fact that we really, as human entities, don't exist for a great long time in philosophy until about the 16 or 1700s, at which point the first thing that everyone wants to do is to get us involved in a social contract. And again, here we are reduced to a mob. That's fine. But existence and existentialism is about the individual, an acknowledgement that, yes, we are thrown into the world, but that doesn't mean that we give up. We don't. We do the opposite. We create what we consider to be our essence. And if we can do that, then we have control over our lives. We're not a product. We're not some abstract category. We're constantly defining who we are. We are creating some kind of existence, or is creating some kind of essence out of our actions. And this is what is so fundamental to living a kind of existentialist motto. The fact that all of this is about the human condition. It is about who we are, the fact that we can create ourselves, that we are responsible for ourselves. There are no excuses. And here's the strangest part. This very form of thinking started with the ancient Greeks. Most individuals that study existentialism will say, well, yes, we can find some ideas in certain aspects of Hegel's work, a little bit more in Marx, certainly in Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, and very definitely in Nietzsche. It's true. That is absolutely true. But where we are responsible for our actions and there are no excuses, that kind of thinking starts in the polis. It starts in ancient Athens, when for the first time, mythology and mythological stories and gods and goddesses no longer are controlling our lives. We're going to go it alone. And of course, this is why paideia and lifelong learning was so important, because we need to be able to reconcile our choices to the human condition that we find ourselves in. So there are no excuses. We cannot blame other people. We end up in the mess we end up in because of our choices or our decision not to make a choice. So this kind of thinking is very ancient. But what's odd is from that point on, it seemed to be buried under all kinds of verbiage and metaphysical jargon about abstract concepts and categories about the world and never really about us until now. So this is a very important kind of philosophy because it may sound difficult or different, and it certainly is, but what we do matters. What we say matters. How we interact with others matters. We're making choices both on behalf of ourselves, but depending on the position we find ourselves in within society, we could be making decisions on behalf of the entire human race. Whether or not we pollute, whether or not we drive an electric car versus a gas guzzler, whether we welcome immigrants and refugees and those others from war-torn countries or countries that are facing dire conditions because of climate change, that we open our doors to others who are less fortunate. All those things matter. All those behaviors matter because they make us who we are, who you and I are, but also our community, our country, our civilization, ultimately. And we can't avoid those responsibilities. We need to embrace them. We need to acknowledge them. We need to wrestle with them. But we need to at least realize that we can make a decision. We can make a choice. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, the notion of trying to live an authentic life has been around for a very, very long time. And no one has ever said it's going to be easy. because we can give in easily. We can't give up the fight, right? We can just kind of cave to social pressures and so on. But living an authentic life is still something worth pursuing. It's worth doing because you can own your life. And last week we talked about Nietzsche and that will to power. And again, the will to power here is not a political slogan or the right for you to punch someone in the head that stands in your way. No, it is the will to power to change your life and to change your life in a more authentic way. Now, as I also mentioned a moment ago, the ancient Athenians, the ancient Greeks, had a real fear of this kind of authentic living, right? Assuming a responsibility was a very, very radical idea, because prior to that, we could always claim that it was the gods or goddesses that were influencing our thinking and our actions. And mythological gods were often blamed for misfortunes of one sort or another. And so with that, if the gods and goddesses could potentially ensnare us in some net, and the end result is just horrible things, then of course we would be terrified, right? Terrified to take the next step. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why the ancient Athenian culture is so concerned with the individual fitting into the community. This is, again, one of the reasons why I've set up this course the way I have, because I want these links to come together and become very explicit and for you to see, okay, all right, that's why we looked at these particular things. And here's another example of why we start what we do in ancient Athens and how the community was so important. In fact, it supersedes the individual. In other words, the individual is brought into the community because at that time, individual thinking is considered to be wrong or perhaps even dangerous because it is behavior that is motivated by pride and by hubris. This isn't the same thing, but certainly there is this terror of taking the next step because individuals in ancient Greece had created a world for themselves, but they were also quite aware that it was only one step from complete chaos. So yes, you bring the world into existence, but you know that lying just behind or beyond that world is a kind of chaotic existence. And that's what they were trying to avoid doing. So the individual was sacrificed for the consistency of the community. So it takes until about at the very earliest, the early 1800s. But as an actual philosophy, existentialism really doesn't come into being until after the Second World War, the 1940s. But here are the same ideas, right, that are motivating these thinkers. A fear of the individual in ancient Athens. Therefore, he or she is sacrificed to the community because communal living, communal thinking, group thinking is perhaps more reasonable and less likely to fail when everyone has an input as to what the right thing might be. There's a kind of consensus that's being achieved here. And of course, this is the way that Plato would think all the time. Now we're back to us, ourselves. Because guess what? All of the institutions we were told to believe in at the beginning of the 20th century, the ones that Nietzsche was actively trying to destroy, what did they lead to? Bloodshed. First World War, and if that wasn't enough, less than 25 years later, another World War. So the amount of blood and carnage that was shed because of rationality, technology, science, patriotism, nationalism, those things, those institutions became terrifying. So there is now renewed focus placed on the individual as the person who can make those decisions best. And it makes sense. So we see changes occurring in the early 1800s. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche did talk about ideas regarding the individual, the human condition, and the fact that existence comes first, right? It is that starting point because our existence belongs to us. We are in charge, or we should be in charge of ourselves. And anyone that tells you that they're going to think for you or on your behalf or they know better, those people are evil. They are absolutely evil when it comes to this kind of thinking. Existentialism is saying, no, think for yourself. Question authority. That doesn't mean set fire to a post office. It means think for yourself. Decide what is going to be the best course of action. Again, still staying within the legal framework. And just because someone irritates you Doesn't mean you reserve the right to kill them, of course not. But you need to figure out a proper way to deal with these problems, these obstacles and ambiguities that occur in life. So, Jean-Paul Sartre, perhaps one of the most important thinkers and philosophers of existentialism, certainly took his ideas from Kierkegaard and thought that Kierkegaard was perhaps one of the very first philosophers to really push back against philosophical systems. Now, Nietzsche as well, but certainly Kierkegaard was the first one. And this notion of existence, right? Existence is the way in which we can truly be human, right? That we can mold ourselves and we can make those either-or decisions that Kierkegaard had made and realized. On the one hand, either I marry my childhood sweetheart and live a happy, middle-class existence and no bumps or obstacles along the road, or I strike out on my own and I think my way through my life and I create my life. My existence is who I am. This is my calling card. This is the person that I wish to become and are trying to become. Now, the one thing that Sartre did not sort of import into his thinking was Kierkegaard's beliefs in the existence of God and the fact that if all else fails, we simply make a leap of faith into the arms of God and everything is going to be fine. Well, Sartre says, look, how do we even know it's going to be there to catch us, right? We don't know. And if we are thinking this way, we're relinquishing some of our ability to make choices to another entity, another power, another authority figure. In this case, it's God. Prior to that, it would have been really any other institution that tries to do the thinking for you or tells you how to behave. Now, clearly, there are duties and expectations of people in society, and that's true. Sartre and other existentialists absolutely knew that and respected it. So it isn't a matter of being an absolute rebel, but it is a way to navigate through the choices that we have, and they are there, but to do it in such a way that they are meaningful to us and they give us a degree of authenticity. So although Kierkegaard was generally of interest to Sartre and to Beauvoir, it wasn't really Kierkegaard that they were enamored with as much as they were to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche had done an awful lot of work, in particular one book that he had written called The Genealogy of Morals. And this is a book, and of course Beyond Good and Evil is another one. They're really kind of companion books, my mistake. They are in the sense that Nietzsche did a kind of deep dive into cultural history and provided a critique of that cultural history in order to try to find out the psychology, right, of human behavior and the psychology of making choices. And why is it that certain choices are considered bad and others are good? Well, who says so? Who is in charge of that value system that designates envy and jealousy as bad when in fact Nietzsche says, no, owe up to it. You're feeling jealous and envious of someone, then owe up to it. It is because it's something they have you want, right? So do you deny yourself? Again, within the letter of the law, if someone is acting in a certain way that you would like to be, then do everything you can to make that happen. But it doesn't mean you harm someone. You actively go and harm them or kill them or anything like that. This is not what this is about. But what Nietzsche did and was able to unpack very carefully is this history of cultural development and how it impacted human behavior. As these moral systems became generated through religious ideas and moral ideas, Nietzsche said more and more, those that benefited from the behavior of others in a very rigid, sort of conforming kind of way, would of course be the ones that would say that jealousy is bad, being submissive is good, being humble is good, the meek shall inherit the earth. Seriously? To sit around and do nothing and you're going to inherit? No, you've got to fight for things. You have to fight for the things that matter. So this is the kind of thinking that starts with Kierkegaard and certainly comes into full bloom with Nietzsche and then is brought in to this new form of thinking, existentialism, by Sartre and by Simone de Beauvoir. So here in this world, There is much less a sense of religion or theology or even God, because this is, again, it's an institution that we can rest up against. We're on our own. We are literally on our own. The way we live life, it would be to be throwing ourselves not into faith, but into life itself. What does life have to offer? And many of you, as students, international students, you are living this. I don't want to say you're living the dream, but you're living this kind of existence. You know that for you to have what you really want, you need to make some serious sacrifices. And those kinds of ideas come from Schopenhauer, right? Right? That we have obstacles that we have to overcome. Happiness is temporary until we turn the corner and yet another obstacle is in its, lays in its way. So that kind of thinking, the fact that you need to make sacrifices to get what you want, because you will deserve it by that point. That is perhaps the motivation that many of you have to do the things you have done so far. Make the sacrifices that you have made so far, because that is an authentic life. No one's saying it's easy. It isn't. It's very difficult and it's lonely and you feel homesick and you want to say, oh God, is this even, every day, is this worth it? Yes, it is. Yes, it is worth it, because you are the one that's going to be able to change your life by finishing school and working somewhere else, living in different parts of the world. All of this is living existentially, right? Living authentically. So existentialism, yes, it's a way of doing philosophy, but it is also a way to live your life, right? To think existentially is very vital to the human condition, because that is what you think about. How can I make my condition better? How can I improve my life? And so existentialist philosophy is exactly that way of life for concrete, living human individuals and their way of thinking, to be both connected to themselves, to their needs and wants and desires and passions and drives, and still be connected to others, right? Because this is not sort of a go it alone thing. Yes, it is, but that doesn't mean you destroy society in so doing. You still are social beings. We all are social beings. We cannot be anything else. So again, we do this within the letter of the law. We are not such horrible people that even though, like Nietzsche, we still can do what we need to do or have to do. And if other people suffer, so what? Nietzsche's kind of language, a very aggressive form of thinking, gets softened somewhat in existentialism, because there's not such this violent view of the world, but one in which we are connected, but authentically connected with one another. That's what matters. So the call for authenticity is really what matters. And this idea of be yourself, that's Socrates talking, right? 2,500 years prior, his voice echoes into the 20th century. Be yourself. Now, yes, question authority, but mostly be yourself, because who you are is your essence, and that is what matters. So prior to Sartre, this was a message that was perhaps not heard properly, or maybe it was falling on deaf ears. But what we needed to do was become, first of all, aware that the statement is even being made, and then to figure out how to go about it, right? Okay, so I'm going to be myself. What does that involve? Well, it involves being, the center of your universe in the actions that you choose to follow through with. That's what he meant, Sartre, that is, when we are going to wake up our being with a capital B, our existence. We're going to wake that up for the first time and realize that we have choices. So be yourself is more a kind of call to action, right? To rouse our thinking and make us realize that, yes, we can do things that will absolutely change our lives and hopefully the lives of those around us in a positive way. So that is essentially existentialism. Now, the next part here, I want to talk about a couple of different thinkers. The first one is Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre studied phenomenology, the study of things coming into being, how we understand things, very much about relating to and understanding reality and the reality of phenomenon, right? To experience a book or a table. What are all the things that that are involved in us recognizing that what we're looking at is in fact a book or a table. So studies consciousness. It studies the relationship between objects and subjects, the objects of direct experience. And so phenomenology is an understanding of ourselves situated in the world, coupled with the very close readings of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel. That's really the background for Sartre. And he really worked hard to create this science in which human beings, human subjects, could critically reflect upon their intentions, their hopes, fears, desires, and all the things that make us who we are, make us alive. And in so doing, to try to live a life that would create its own meaning so that we could truly say existence precedes essence. Just because we're human doesn't mean we can qualify with the essential characteristics of humanity. Our existence is going to say, yes, this person is who they are, because their behavior is consistent. They are consistently honest, they are truthful, they are temperate, they are moderate, all these things that are obviously virtues that Aristotle would have thought quite highly of. But at this particular time, we own them, right? We take command of these and we act on them. And so Sartre is thinking about the study of consciousness and our experience, our interaction with experience, mixes that with Kierkegaard and Hegel, and also throws in Schopenhauer's idea of introspection so that we can critically think about our lives and ourselves. So if you're thinking this way, you can only imagine what the outbreak of World War II would have done. And Sartre was actually captured as early as 1940. And he was released when the armistice between France and Germany was signed. So he was basically imprisoned during the period of the war. So during his time in the armed services, he was essentially there as a POW. Imagine thinking about questions of freedom while incarcerated, right? While a POW, a prisoner of war, and thinking about freedom. So there's nothing like not having something to make you articulate in great detail what that thing is that you lack in your life. Freedom. What does it look like? How can I achieve it? How can I maintain it? And then maybe give it to others. And so the question of freedom, intellectual, phenomenological, philosophical freedom, freedom in its totality, this became sort of the central core of Sartre's work. And it is during his imprisonment, during 1940 to 44, that he started to think about in more seriousness this question of freedom. And he eventually wrote a book called Being and Nothing in 1943. And so as a result, his ideas really were taken to heart by many other French individuals because they had all lived through the same thing. He was kind of preaching to the choir. And so Sartre's ideas about questions of freedom and describing freedom as not an intolerable burden that was going to crush us, but something that we needed to do something about, right? We needed to address the questions of freedom that we now had. And of course, this kind of thinking resonated with other individuals because of the fact that they had all experienced generally the same kind of imprisonment, that France was overtaken by the Germans, by the Nazis, and there were many people that welcomed it because they were extreme right-wing thinkers, but there were also just as many revolutionaries that fought against Nazism. That's the group that Sartre was writing to, right, and writing about. So this notion of freedom and questions regarding freedom were absolutely understood implicitly, intuitively, unconsciously by the French population, especially those who did not welcome the Nazis in the 1940s. So that was kind of the audience for Sartre's work. And of course, it made a tremendous impact because he managed to say in words what people were feeling, right? And questions of freedom became absolutely paramount. Now, one of the ways in which we can think about freedom and non-freedom is this idea of bad faith. And Sartre talks about bad faith and almost in opposition to the idea of consciousness. Where we are conscious, and especially self-conscious, we are aware of the things that we do, we're aware of the actions that we're performing. But if we are doing them in bad faith, according to Sartre, we're doing it because of the pressure from social forces, we're adopting false values, we're disowning our own sense of freedom. We're doing something not because we have to, but because we want to. To do something in good faith is to do something because you embrace it 110%. You wish to do this. I wish to act this way. I'm not being told to. And in fact, the social forces are kind of the opposite. But those social forces and values, if they are counterintuitive to what you think is right, if you are caving to those forces, you're actually living and acting in bad faith. That's what he meant. So not only this issue of bad faith and living inauthentically, the other main idea is between, as you can see from the title of the book, being and nothingness. And so being are all the objects that are available to consciousness. Now also subjects. So being, that's kind of the phenomenology part, right? All the objects and subjects in our purview, right? In our sight lines that are available to consciousness to think about. A large tree, a beautiful park, a person, an animal, a car, whatever it is. Because we are, right? We are always in a sense of being. We have objects and subjects that come across our purview constantly, all the time. So we have on the one hand, this busy world of objects and subjects, and then we have nothingness, right? We have this blank slate that is our consciousness. And much like John Locke in his tabula rasa, right, that blank slate that we have when we are born, our interaction with objects and subjects in the world, authentic interactions, now begin to write our consciousness. If our interactions have been good and positive and plentiful and really generate good feelings amongst the individuals that you interact with, then your consciousness is going to start building on ideas that have to do with being kind and a generous person. That will become your essence. So being is us existing in the world, interacting with objects and subjects, and the nothingness, which isn't nothing for very long, but the nothingness that is our consciousness as we begin to interact in the world and then keep score, right? Take stock through our memories of the events that have occurred in our lives and how they have shaped us into who we are. So as we perceive objects, consciousness becomes a being for itself, right? So it exists for itself because it has freedom, right? Consciousness is free. This is us. It is where we find human consciousness. So consciousness has being for itself. And it is able to be the motivator and the drive and the influence behind that interaction with the world. So consciousness has being for itself, while an object out in the world has being in itself. So that object that we encounter, that tree, that park bench, the world, the car, whatever, it has being in itself. And so our interactions with these objects formulate and form and create a memory which becomes eventually our essence. But consciousness, and this is the important one, consciousness is the one that is being for itself. So here are some of the ideas that we've talked about so far, some of the main concepts. We have the first one, bad faith, which is essentially lying to oneself. We try to escape the responsibilities of freedom, of being for itself, or we're not being authentic. And we give in too easily. We cave too much to pressures. We cave too much because obstacles seem to be insurmountable. And we give in. So Sartre says, no, this is bad faith. This is not good, right? Don't lie to yourself. You know that you're doing this because you have to, not because you want to. So if we are escaping this degree of freedom that we have and the responsibility we have to act upon that freedom, right, we're now not responding to our being for itself in a faithful way, in an authentic way. Then the other two, which I know are a little bit difficult to grasp, but let's try it this way. Being for itself, right, is to be incompletely or completely conscious of one's own existence. So my being is for me. My being is for me to act upon, to make an impression upon my consciousness. So it has no predetermined essence. We're not born a certain way. We become something. Being for itself must create itself out of nothing. So the nothingness is the empty world that is out there waiting to be interacted with, waiting to be experienced. Subjects as well, people that we interact with. So the being for itself is created out of that nothingness that is the world outside the mind, the world outside our brain, if you like. And of course, being in itself, the being of things, the existence of things. And of course, if it's an object, then that object doesn't have a consciousness, which is why it is a being in itself. It simply exists, right? The being of things, the existence of external phenomena. And that's that kind of phenomenological part, of Sartre's thinking. Now, behind all of this, behind bad faith, being for itself, being in itself, is this idea of intentionality. And intentionality is the motivator for people to behave in certain ways. So we have to remember, my consciousness is mine, but I'm aware of it. And when I'm very young, I don't realize that I have one. So I just kind of act instinctively or just act on desire. And as I get older and become a little bit wiser and realize that my brain is in fact connected to my body, I now can intend things. I intend to speak, so I learn language. I tend to behave in a certain way. So intentionality becomes more and more the way in which that nothingness, which is the outside world, how that nothingness impresses itself upon my consciousness, upon my being for itself. So consciousness is always consciousness of something. We can't sit and have literally nothing in our minds. Some people can. I know I can't. But the mind, for sure, is rarely blank for very long. So when we talk about nothingness that is in consciousness, that lasts for a very, very short time. Even children, as they start to amass, an understanding of the world around them, that there is a reality beyond themselves, we're always going to intend to direct ourselves towards something or someone. That is simply how we act in the world. We interact with objects and subjects in that world, and all of it is of equal measure. They're all nothingness before we encounter them, but they become something when we do. So Sartre continues, and this is a quote from Being and Nothingness. He says, "It is best to choose and to examine one determined attitude which is essential to human reality, and which is such that consciousness, instead of directing its negation outward, turns it inward towards itself. This attitude, it seems to me, is bad faith. But is man, fortunately that's what he says, but let's say, are human beings who they are? And more generally, how can he or she be what he or she is when he or she exists as consciousness of being? How can we be thinking that we can be something else or act differently when we're acting completely the opposite to our intentions? So this is what he means when we could be guilty of bad faith. That when we examine an attitude we have towards a behavior or an idea, we know in the back of our minds that that idea is stupid or that behavior is stupid, but we do it anyway because we're forced to, or we think others expect that of us. So expectation versus intentionality, those two forces are really at work in existentialism, and we should, as much as possible, fall on the side of intentionality. Ask ourselves, what do I intend by my actions? Do I wish to follow through this because I truly believe in this action, or because I'm expected to act this way? And if it is a degree of expectations, which shifts us in the other direction, now you're beginning to move towards the notion of bad faith. So our consciousness of being is telling us one thing, but we're doing the opposite. That's really what he says. Now, at no point can we step outside of these situations that we find ourselves in which we need to respond. And those situations are populated with objects as well as subjects. And we need those social situations in order to act in any kind of meaningful way. We can't exist out in the wilderness because there's no one else around. We cannot try to achieve complete psychosis and become non-social individuals. I wouldn't recommend that whatsoever. But what we need to do is to be mindful and aware that we are always in social situations. whether we are in a crowd or with friends or anywhere, it doesn't matter. Because without that situation, right, our freedom to act would only be just someone just free floating. I'm doing it because my name is Robinson Crusoe and I live alone on an island. I can do whatever I want. Well, that's not saying a whole lot. I'm existing and I'm in a situation, but it's not a social situation. There isn't even one other person around. Now, it is rare we find ourselves in a situation like that, but for the most part, when we are acting, we usually are in social situations of one sort or another. And so the test of freedom cannot really go through if we're not in a kind of social situation of any sort. So we're not acting randomly or irrationally. We're doing it because we are still free in that same social setting. We're not caving into pressures. We are doing something because we believe that this is correct. Now, as I'm talking, I don't in any way want to intend that I supported the Freedom Convoy earlier this year, or that I think, masking mandates and social distancing and vaccines are stupid and wrong. I don't. And this is where there's a huge distinction between the so-called tyranny and government overreach regarding the pandemic and the tyranny and government overreach of an entirely different kind. I think the government did the best they could, municipal, provincial and federal and so on. They did the best that they could with the information that they had at the time. And, masking and social distancing was the right thing. Because here we are in a social situation and we're being told, yes, in order to keep yourself safe and others safe, do the following. It sounds like a good idea. It fits in with my concept of being a good citizen. And if it was anything else, if someone said, please go and harm every immigrant that you find, I go, hell no, absolutely not. But if they say, wear a mask because it's going to be beneficial to the health of society, that's different. So I just want to get this out of the way because I'm talking about freedom and intentionality and, social situations. The freedom does not mean to act randomly or irrationally. To irrationally think that government tyranny is an overreach happened during the pandemic, that's acting irrationally. That's acting for entirely different reasons than the fact that there is a pandemic. So just want to make that clear. Okay, so if we look into ourselves and we become aware of our consciousness, we do see that we collect over time personality traits, qualities and tendencies. We have certain limitations. We have blind spots and prejudices and biases of one sort or another, and it does happen. But all of these things now sort of identify us as a certain kind of person. Now, those qualities and traits and tendencies don't define us forever. If we become aware that we have a prejudice or bias or blind spot towards something, the very awareness of that blind spot is the first step towards overcoming it, to become a better person with better personality traits and better human qualities. So these kinds of things over time, as we think about our consciousness and introspect and reflect and, critically think about who we are, then we are able to become better and better versions of ourselves. The notion behind existentialism is a constant becoming, right? A constant becoming of a better and better person. So Descartes had said, I think, therefore I am. So that there's that absolutely individual statement. Sartre says, okay, yeah, but this is one that may be more effective and more fitting for this day and age, which is, of course, after the Second World War. I am nothing. Therefore, I am free. I have no qualities, traits, tendencies, limitations, or whatever. I am nothing. I am a blank slate. Therefore, I am free. I can move in any direction. And that's the part that makes people very, very anxious, because all of a sudden, what do? Right? We're back to the ancient Greeks. What do? I don't want to make a misstep. So we need to make that distinction between self-consciousness, right? Our knowledge, our acknowledgement of who we are, of our conscious being, and consciousness of things. So consciousness of things, the first self-consciousness looks inward. consciousness of things looks outwards to the world. Because for Sartre, right, we think about the world that is crucial. It is about the world, our behavior in it, not the fact that it merely exists, not the fact of the world itself. No, what will I do in this world? How will I navigate through it? How will I affect other people? And of course, we become sort of more problematic when we are no longer thinking of consciousness of things, but consciousness of other subjects. So when we say that we have being for self, right, my self-consciousness, and out there is being in itself, right, being in itself also includes subjects, but subjects also have being for itself. So we can interact with people. We become conscious of something, right? That other person's gaze, the object of the other person's consciousness. And what it is it becomes a mutual recognition of each party of that other individual's being for self. So objects in itself, another person being for itself. Each one of us has a being for itself. And it's what we do with those beings that define who we are, that define our essence. So if we truly exist, if we exist authentically, and we are mindful of bad faith versus good, we are mindful of intentionality, then we can actually lift ourselves up into this new existence. And we can transcend, right, this situation that we find ourselves in into a better situation rather than remaining immanent, right? So transcendence lifts us up and outwards, immanence downward and within ourselves. We become morose, we introspect too much. We guess what? We are afraid to take the next move, right? So the Greek population were actually more immanent than they were transcendent. And what I mean by that is they were resting quietly within themselves in the community and afraid to make a move on their own, right? They needed consensus. They needed confirmation. Okay, am I doing the right thing? What about this? What about that? I need to ask my friends. So if you are thinking imminently or suffering from imminence, you're basically folding yourself in within yourself and your group. You want to do the opposite. You want to transcend, right? You want to move up. And you want to be able to be ready, as Hegel said, to tarry with the negative, right? To fight, right? To fight against complacency, bad faith. And it sounds exhausting. It sounds difficult. But it could also be exhilarating, right? This is your life. You own it, you act within it, and you interact with other people. So if you live an unexamined life, which is again one of Socrates' most famous sayings, to live an unexamined life is to live no life at all. And it took 2,500 years for that message to be finally addressed in a significant way. And existentialism, along with be yourself, right? An unexamined life is a life not worth living. That is a life of bad faith. So we need to understand that the art of an examined life lies in knowing that the things you're doing and saying and thinking are yours alone because you want to. Now we're going to finish up the third part of this with an examination of Simone de Beauvoir, who unfortunately in this course is literally the only female philosopher that we look at. And that is tragic. I wish I could have brought up more individuals, and I know there have been more. It's just that history has designated them to the dustbin, and it's awful. But Simone de Beauvoir is here, and her ideas are very, very important. Now, one of the really interesting aspects about Beauvoir, is the fact that she didn't really even think of herself as a philosopher at first. She trained in, and she did extremely well. She was almost understood it almost intuitively. But she originally wanted to just be an author, just an author of fiction, which she continued to be, even though she was a philosopher. But she found her voice when she started to write about things, about life and about being a woman and about being a philosopher. Now, again, I started off all of this by talking about the living individual, the historical living, breathing subject. And this is something I want you to consider when we think about Beauvoir's work, because this is one of the first times when we hear the female voice, the woman's voice in philosophy. This is what makes her work so, so important. The main book, and she wrote several and lots of fiction as well, but the really important book is a book called The Second Sex that came out in 1949. And as you can imagine, for the first time hearing from literally the other half of the population globally, this book was revolutionary in all kinds of ways. It overturned all the accepted traditional ideas about the nature of human existence, that all of a sudden, when we talk about abstract beings, we're really actually talking about men, not women, because the moment you apply these really strange ideas about abstract beings to women, it doesn't fit. That's the kind of thinking that Beauvoir was going through. Is she did a deep dive into the history of human consciousness as it related to women. So there's that living entity, right? That living component in her work. So she overturned accepted ideas about the nature of human existence. She also encouraged its readers to question and overturn their own existence, because Beauvoir saw that women were essentially almost second-class citizens, if they were even considered citizens at all. So what The Second Sex is a kind of applied existentialism. It applies these ideas and it tackles two very serious and very grand subjects. The first is the patriarchal history of humanity. And that is basically what we know today and has been for thousands of years, which is a male-centered universe. It is a patriarchal history of humanity. It's a story of history as told by men, about men, to other men. So that's what makes it patriarchal. And then so there is the larger sort of macro view of patriarchy, and then there's the micro view of the individual history of a woman's entire life from birth to old age. And again, we had never heard these ideas talked about before, and they are done with a tremendous amount of passion here. So Beauvoir's main idea here was stating that growing up female was a lot more unique and different than anyone had ever been stated before, because we had never heard from the other side. We had never heard a female or feminist or woman-centered perspective. This was brand new. And of course, very simple things, that in France were very obvious, saying, okay, well, growing up female is unique, more so than men, because, for example, the right to vote was not given to women until 1944. They continue to lack many of the basic rights. A married woman could not even open a bank account until 1965. Obviously, an unmarried woman could, but a married woman could not even have a bank account until 1965. Because of these kinds of things, these instituted penalties and situations that women found themselves in, very quickly they realized, look, I'm a second-class citizen here. I occupy a secondary position in relation to the world, right? Which is the world run by men. And this position, right, what they found themselves in, Beauvoir called it a gendered position. It's gendered male-female. And so the position of men in society is vastly different than the position of women in the same society. And the difference is not because of the hair color or, the kind of shoes they wear or where they live. It's who they are. It's their sex. And so a gendered position in society had everything to do with the severe limitations that women had in French society following the Second World War and around the world as well. And those positions that are reinforced by social traditions, by education or lack of sometimes, all these things created these gendered positions for women that essentially held them back. Now, that is one kind. There were legal differences that also were making it very, very difficult for women to live any kind of an authentic life. So women being in the world, right, and acting on intentionality and so on was absolutely the opposite of men's, that the idea of even existing in a world that is nothing but limitations, you're not really existing at all, because you don't have a choice. You can only live a certain way. You can only get a certain kind of education. You need to live and you need to get married before you can have any kind of financial security, etc. All of these things, these requirements and constraints and expectations that women had to follow through with in French society and around the world were what Beauvoir called the myths of femininity. And this kind of language Beauvoir was using and borrowing from Nietzsche, the way in which he dug down into the cultural history and human history to find out, well, who created this moral value system and who benefits from it? Beauvoir did exactly the same thing. She did a deep dive into patriarchal history and realized very quickly, absolutely the world is constructed this way to benefit men. It is not there to benefit women. And again, with any kind of critical thinking, the first step is to acknowledge that there is a problem and to identify it as such. Now, in the same way that Sartre's famous phrase is existence precedes essence, the one for Simone de Beauvoir is, again, equally rich. She writes, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And what she means by this is the following. Young girls are born and they begin to learn to act differently. They have to act modestly and properly. Boys literally are just little instinctual creatures running around doing whatever. They're, just playing and having fun. And by comparison, little girls, right? And again, she's writing in the 1940s and things have clearly changed for the better. So compared to young boys, right? Little boys, little girls behave modestly and properly. They wear pretty dresses. They don't get dirty. They don't play in the mud. And girls very quickly become very self-aware that they are positioned in space. They're not interacting and acting in space. They're simply just positioned. In other words, they're there to be viewed. They're there almost as objects, right? Because if you're a second-class citizen, you're less likely to be a citizen or subject or an individual. You're positioned in space. And what happens is you don't constitute anything in terms of your movements. As much as possible, remain still, right? That's what Beauvoir meant. That a woman is not born, but becomes a woman. They have to grow into these limitations, into all these the lack of choices that women had at that particular time. And not only that, but one of the greatest inhibitions for woman is to see herself as the other to man. Now, earlier I mentioned when we encounter, as we move through the world, we encounter other subjects, not objects, but other subjects, and we mutually recognize one another as each having a being for consciousness. This doesn't happen to women because they are second-class citizens. And so the notion of women seeing themselves as being other equally to men, no, that doesn't happen because they are simply man, not man. A woman is not a woman. A woman is simply not a man. And this kind of thinking is patriarchal thinking. So how can a woman be a transcendent subject in her own right when she is given so few options to transcend? Instead, it's out of the classroom and into the kitchen, right? That's literally the walk from one institution into the other. And these were the options that many women had in French society, and of course Western European society in general. But rather than being a transcendent being or a transcendent subject, which is what existentialism is asking us to be, women feel simply or face immanence, right? They're closed in and collapse into the family, into the private realm. And so women try to see themselves as objects, as subjects, when in fact the only subject in that equation between man and woman is man is the subject because he is the citizen, he is the individual, the subject under the law, and woman sees herself simply as an object. there is no mutual recognition between a subject and an object. There is between two subjects, but if there is no mutual recognition of the being for itself on the other end of that equation, i.e. women, no, then mutual recognition really is not happening. There's nothing authentic about that relationship at all. So Beauvoir really had an intimate and deep understanding of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Now, what this really is about is, and I'll be very brief because we don't talk about it when we look at Hegel, but the master-slave dialectic is this formula where the master needs the slave in order to identify himself as such. But the slave really does not need the master because the slave is working on behalf of the master and creating this world. The slave actually sees themselves reflected in the world they have created. And so compared to the master, who doesn't exist as a master without a slave, the slave can exist by itself. The slave can exist by him or herself. And so Beauvoir applies the same idea to relations of love, for example, as some sort of reciprocal, equation between two equal participants, which we know are not, right? They're not equal because real human relationships in society are already instituted differences because of gender. One group has many opportunities. One group has very few opportunities. Those gendered roles are occupied by men or women. And again, this is something which is beginning to break down in a rather significant way. So if it sounds almost old-fashioned, it was written in the 1940s, but this book was remarkable. We have to at least consider that. So what Sartre was saying about Hegel was that, this notion of mutual recognition, that's all fine and good. But here was Sartre living authentically with his intentionality with a blind spot. The blind spot was, he forgot that women are second-class citizens. You can't have mutual recognition between a man and a woman in France in the 1940s. They are not equal. Therefore, mutual recognition is somewhat of a misnomer. So Beauvoir was able to use Hegel's notion of alienation and master-slave to correct this. She understood that the master-slave relationship was one that was much closer in spirit to the male-female relationship in society than Sartre ever saw. So, woman, according to Beauvoir, lives much of her life in bad faith because she has very few options. She tends to cave to social pressures. And again, this is the 1940s and things have thankfully changed for the better. And if that's the case, then women would be suffering from what Sartre calls bad faith because they are inert, they are objectified, and they buy into the subjectification. They're the object of the male gaze. They are immanent because they are frozen, almost frozen images. They're not transcending in any kind of way, developing with terms of education, social networks and so on, moving forward towards a greater and greater expanded notion of consciousness. No, these options aren't there. Those possibilities aren't there in French society at this time. And that's what Beauvoir's book does. It exposes this lie of freedom that women had to live under, knowing full well. Again, this book was popular and influential because women knew. They knew instinctively what was going on. But Beauvoir puts it into words. Here's how this has worked for so long, because these roles are not, interchangeable. They are gendered. These are gendered roles. So what happens is, for a woman being a waitress, a nurse, or whatever, but for a woman, she's expected to act this way all the time. Obviously, you could be a waitress, you could be also a student, you could be a mother, you could be all kinds of things. But the problem is, gendered roles would identify women almost with their occupation. So once a nurse, always a nurse. Once a waitress, always a waitress. And so that really was showing up the negative aspects of existentialism, the notion of bad faith, the notion of immanence. And it's not as if women welcomed it. They didn't. Beauvoir said, no, we are this way because we have no choice, right? There's no choice in the matter. So the second sex, in the end, really maps out this very complicated interaction between free choice, biology, social and cultural factors, and how all of these things together interact to create a gendered human being, right? Who is now sort of set in her ways because of a lack of opportunities. So again, to be clear, when we talk about sex and gender, right, the biology of a person is the sex they're born into. And of course, that can be changed throughout life, male to female to male, or anything in between. But free choice, that's social and political. Biological, that's sexuality. Social and cultural factors, that's gender. And all of these items need to be negotiated and interacted with in some significant way for a woman to be able to move anywhere beyond her present state. So Beauvoir writes, the drama of woman lies in this conflict between the fundamental aspirations of every subject, right? The being for itself, the willing to move into greater and greater realms of freedom, who always regards herself as the essential, and the compulsion of a situation. The compulsion, the gender pressure, right? The pressure to conform, the compulsion of a situation in which she is inessential. So that essential being, that's now motivated by consciousness. I wish to become this person. But what is inessential are all of the limitations that woman finds herself in society. That's what Beauvoir was talking about. Ethics of Ambiguity, a book that she wrote, a little slim book, super interesting, argues against this idea of, she says the relationship between a woman's biology, right, her body, and her assertion of freedom is not a problem. It simply is the way that women have been up until this point. It isn't a problem because guess what? The problem was resolved when patriarchy was invented. No longer a problem. Women second-class citizens, men over here. Why that is, the jury is still out. Fear of the procreative possibilities of woman, I don't know. But patriarchy became the solution to the issues that relate between a woman's biology and her assertion of freedom. So, she says the human condition, yes, it may be ambiguous, but our task is to learn to manage the level of uncertainty rather than ignore ambiguity, to at least realize that there is a degree of it. The more we make choices, the less the world is ambiguous. That's really what she's saying. So The Ethics of Ambiguity really is a book that is a companion piece to Sartre's Being and Nothingness. It tries to address some of these issues that come up in Sartre's very thick 800 or 900 page book. And in Ethics of Ambiguity, which is literally about 120 pages, kind of gets right to the point. And she says essentially this: yes, the human condition is ambiguous, but our task, our job, right, our consciousness should learn to manage the level of uncertainty by being able to actively make choices. More choices, less ambiguity. So if we can overcome the ambiguity of life, it means we're taking control of ourselves, the objects and subjects that interact in our lives, and woman especially to understand herself as having been limited by social and economic circumstances, but still able to break through. And of course, this is not going to be easy, but it has to start. The first step is identifying the problem and letting other people know that it is a problem, that women cannot transcend if they are locked into limited gender roles. So existentialism, for all of the reasons that I've described, ends up being the philosophy that best enables Beauvoir and others to do this, because it is, at the end of the day, about freedom and contingency, but freedom to do things and contingency from being able to do those things. So freedom and contingency are sort of opposite ends. So if we can act towards the pole of freedom and away from contingency, the more we will be able to live an authentic life. And so she writes, and I'm going to end with this in Ethics of Ambiguity, quote, "To declare that existence is absurd is to deny that it can ever be given a meaning. To say that it is ambiguous is to assert that its meaning can never be fixed, that it must be constantly one. So, if we say that life is absurd, then it will never have any kind of meaning for us or anyone else. But that's different. Absurdity is different from ambiguity. Ambiguity is simply something is unclear. So to say that it is ambiguous is to assert that its meaning can never be fixed, that it must be constantly one. So absurdity challenges every ethics, but the finished rationalization of the real world would leave no room for ethics. And again, ethics is about choices. So absurdity says anything goes, right? Don't make every choice, make no choice. Doesn't matter. It's absurd. No. She ends, it is because man's condition is ambiguous. Now here, remarkably enough, she writes, when she says man, she means everyone, even though she had written the second sex. And in that book, she's very specific in distinguishing man from woman. So it is because man's condition is essentially ambiguous that he seeks, through failure and outrageousness, to save his existence. So life is ambiguous. Let's embrace it and acknowledge it. But the more choices we can make, the more we can keep that at bay, right? If we don't, then we will fail and we will suffer in bad faith. So that is essentially existentialism, Simone de Beauvoir's remarkable work, The Second Sex, that really opens up in a significant way ideas about feminism and feminist thought within the confines of philosophy. So it moves both out into the social and economic world and then back into philosophy, but a remarkable book when it came out and part of what we'd say probably the second wave of feminism. There's now 4 at this point. But prior to that is Sartre and all of his ideas about bad faith, living an inauthentic life, being for itself, which is us in our growing consciousness, and nothingness, or being in itself, the nothingness that is the world waiting for us to interact with. Okay, so that's the second last video lecture for this course. I'm going to come back next week with another sort of French angle with the Situationist International. So until then, take care and we'll see you in a week.